Hi, I'm Philip Esterly, and in this video I'm going to show you how I use Photomatix to make an HDR image out of multiple exposures. When I want to use the HDR effect, what I'll usually do is take 5 exposures, 2 of them underexposed and 2 of them overexposed, and 1 of them at the base exposure, which would be the same exposure I would use for a single image. And the underexposed images are 2 stops and 1 stop underexposed, and the overexposed images are 1 stop and 2 stops overexposed. So this will give me a good range of tonal values both in the highlights and in the shadows, which I can then put together with the HDR process. So here are my 5 images, starting with the underexposed one, and then I'll cycle through to the overexposed images, so that you can see that in the highlights I have more information on the underexposed images, and in the shadows I have more information in the overexposed images. So before I take these 5 images into Photomatix Pro, I'm going to do some development adjustments to these images so I have a good starting point. I will start with some adjustments to the clarity and the saturation and the vibrance. And then I'll also make some profile corrections for the lens that I used. And this basically will take any distortions or vignetting that is inherent to the lens out of my image. So for these images, I remember that I used a Sigma 10 to 20 millimeter lens, and so I'm going to select that in the profile selection so that I can remove the distortion and the vignetting for that lens. I'm also going to go into the color tab of the lens corrections and remove chromatic aberration, which you will sometimes see in high contrast areas like between the mountains and the sky. You might see some fringing in the purple and green. And this happens just due to the optics of the lens. It's something you really don't notice unless you're looking at it very closely. So next I'm going to go into the basic settings and change the color temperature and the tint. This is the white balance basically of the image. If I slide it to the left, the image turns blue, and if I slide it all the way to the right, the image starts to turn yellow. For this image, I'm going to select something around 6500 for my base white balance or temperature. And I'm going to adjust the tint just a little bit as well. Some people might want to select a white balance that is basically natural for that time of day. I don't always do that because sometimes I want my image to be a little bit bluer or a little bit yellower, just depending on the feel that I want to show throughout the image. And then I'm also going to make some adjustments to the exposure settings, basically the highlights and the shadows. I'm going to bump up the shadows a bit and maybe drop down the highlights a little bit, and then maybe play around with the whites and the blacks as well. And then once I've got some starting settings that I'm happy with, what I'm going to do is copy all of the settings from one image onto all of the others so that they all have the same settings before I move them into Photomatix. Now that I have those settings applied to all of the images, I'm going to select them all and then right click and choose the Export and Photomatix Pro option. And this pops up a dialog box with some basic settings for importing these into Photomatix. After this, it's going to convert all the images to TIFF files. and then load them into Photomatix. This may take a little while depending on the speed of your computer or the speed of your hard drive. Once Photomatix has loaded all of these TIFF files, what it does is it gives you a preliminary HDR image based on the settings you used for your previous HDR image that you created in Photomatix. So in that sense, the settings for Photomatix are sticky from one session to another, and that includes if you've shut down Photomatix or even rebooted your computer, it's going to keep the same settings you used for your previous image. And this is very helpful if you are doing HDR exposures for a panoramic image in which you have multiple frames of a single scene that you want to apply the same exact HDR settings to. One thing that you'll notice when doing HDR is that if anything moves from one exposure to the next, it's going to create some ghosting. And there are some options in Photomatix to do this ghost removal automatically. However, with some things it doesn't work very well, and so in this particular case I'm doing it manually. So here I've selected all the clouds, and I'm going to choose one particular exposure to use as my base for that particular section of the image. And in this case, I think I like the -2 exposure the best for the clouds. As far as the process and method selections that you see up on the upper left corner, I usually choose tone mapping for the process and the details enhancer for the method. And the reason I choose this is because it gives me the most control for all of the options I can choose for adjustments to the HDR quality of the image. Some of these controls are self-explanatory, but not all of them are. And the best way I've been able to figure out what each one of them means is to play around with them, slide them left or right to see what changes it makes to the image itself. I'm sure that someone more technical than me can explain what these different sliders do, but I don't know exactly what they do, so I'm not going to try to explain it to you because I'd probably just end up confusing you. Some of them though are kind of obvious, like color saturation and black point maybe, and white point. Gamma is something to do with the brightness of the image, and maybe the saturation highlights, saturation shadows, you can kind of figure out what those do. Others not so much, and so experimentation is a good thing to do here. And from my experience, what I usually do is I will slide these things left or right depending on whether they give me more contrast or less contrast. And usually I'd like more contrast in my images. So I'll just go through these different controls and slide them left or right until I find something that I'm pretty happy with, and then I'll go to the next one. My style as far as post-processing goes is to choose something more contrasty and higher in saturation. And so those are the kind of choices I'll usually gravitate towards when I'm making these adjustments in Photomatix. So once I've made adjustments to all these things and I'm pretty happy with the image, I'm going to go ahead and hit the save and re-import button. And that's going to take it back into Lightroom. One thing I should point out about this save and re-import into Lightroom option is that if you started with your images in a collection or a quick collection or anything like that, it's not going to automatically put them in the collection with the source images. So I go back to the source folder and I find it there, and then I will add it to the collection afterwards if I want to add it to the collection, and that's what I did in this particular case. So here's that HDR image in Lightroom, and one thing I've noticed right away is that this upper right corner seems to be a little bit gray, so I'll adjust that later in Photoshop maybe. And I'm looking here at the edges of the clouds and I'm liking how sharp they are, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to look around at other things, like I just noticed a spot up in the upper left corner that I'll need to fix in Photoshop. Other than that, it's a pretty good start, and what I'm going to do later is take this into Photoshop and make some adjustments to it. So here side by side I have the HDR image over here on the left and one of the original source images on the right, and you can see that I've added more saturation both to the shadows area and to the highlight area, and so the water is a bit bluer, the trees are a bit greener, and I brightened up this rock that's over here on the right side. So that's a pretty good start, and from there what I'm going to do is take this image into Photoshop and make additional edits in there, but I'll save that for another video. So if you have any questions about what I've done in this video, just leave them in the comments here on YouTube or send me an email and I'll get back to you. Thanks a lot.